Okay, so this video is all about the controls on your camera as applied to a point and shoot camera. So we're going to talk about the main controls that you need to worry about, which is the shutter button, the zoom, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, white balance, image quality, image size, the mode that you're shooting in, exposure compensation, maybe focus in metering patterns, and the flash. So these are a lot of the main controls that you're going to have to think about. So I have here a Nikon SD 4000 IS, a lot of letters and numbers there. Has almost no physical controls, not a lot anyway. On the top, which you can't see, it's up here, it says auto, and there's a camera icon and a video icon, so you can either have full auto, some control, which is sort of manual, and then video. Those are the three modes. There's also an on and off switch up here. There's a shutter on the top where you obviously press to take the picture, and there's a zoom ring at the top, and that's basically it. On the back we have a menu button, a play button, and a function button, and then a control wheel in the middle, which we'll see in a second. So this one has very few controls on the outside of the camera. Mostly it's in menus, which is the disadvantage of a small camera, is you don't have a lot of space for actual physical buttons. But we'll look at the menus and see what the things we would want to adjust as we go along. So I'm going to turn this on here. So I've zoomed in here a little bit so you can see the menus a little bit better. Basically what I'm doing is I'm hitting either this play button up here, which you can't really see too well, this function button in the middle with a wheel, control wheel, and then there's a menu button at the bottom. But you'll see the menus over here on the screen, so that's what we really want to look like. The first thing at the top is obviously the zoom, so I can zoom in or zoom out with that zoom button. At the top there you can see that there is a little graph that shows you how much you're zoomed in. You see that little line where it stops? That's the optical zoom range, and it says 3.8 up here, right about there. That is the optical zoom range. That means that's what the lens is actually doing. That's really all we care about most of the time. You could go past that, and you see it turns blue on this camera. That is called digital zoom. And used to be you would never want to use the digital zoom because it would just look terrible. Now it's gotten better so that maybe it's usable up to a certain range, but the farther you go in, the more it's going to look kind of weird and kind of pixelated, like old VCR video or something. So if you can, try to only go to the optical zoom range, which is the lens is doing. Anything past that, the camera's just making up information, kind of blowing up the image. It's called interpolation. So that's the zoom up there on the top. Obviously the power button's up there like we said. There's also the shutter button. One thing you can do, especially on these point and shoot cameras, and most cameras in general now, is you can press the shutter button halfway and it will focus and do all the auto adjustments that you're going to do before you shoot, and it makes it shoot a little faster. So if I press that halfway, you can see it focuses, it beeps, it shows me what it's focusing on. I press the button and there it is. There's the image. Now that's the review mode. So if I press again, now I'm back to live, and now I'm shooting pictures again. You can also press on the function wheel on this camera, and you see I can hit display, and it turns on and off different display options. If I click on the right button, or click the control wheel to the right, it gives me the controls for the flash. So on this mode, I have off and on. I'm going to go back to the menu here and go to aperture priority, which gives me three options for the flash. Up at the top it has on, slow synchro, or off. On means it's going to be on even if the camera doesn't think it needs it. Off means the camera is going to turn it off even though maybe the camera thinks it needs a flash. Slow synchro means it's going to try to shoot the image as if there's no flash, but also add the flash. It's called fill flash. And that is a good little trick that you can use to make outdoor images or images in the shade look a little better, is by using the flash, or you could probably also set it to turn the flash on when you're outside. And you can see it says it's on right there. That will help you fill in shadows in people's eyes and give them a little bit of a pop from the flash on the camera. That's really all these little on-camera flashes are good for, except for really bad lighting in dark places up close, because they're so small and so close to the camera. So we'll talk more about that probably later, but a good little trick is to use the flash outdoors during the daylight, or to turn it off when you're inside and you don't really need it, because it will look better. Generally, natural light will look better than these little flashes that are on these cameras. So that's the flash control there. I'm going to turn it off here. If I click on the left, I click the button, the control wheel on the left side, I get the focus range for this camera, and it's going to be different on each camera, so you really have to check your own camera out and look at the manual and things, unfortunately. But here I have macro. Macro means I'm taking something, pictures of something very close. You can see this camera's kind of cool. It has little tips for you. Flowers and bugs and things like that. That's macro mode. Normal mode is normal. And then infinity means it's going to focus on infinity, something far away, like a landscape. Normally you're going to have this on normal in this camera. The bottom, like I said, is display. The top one is very valuable. So even most of the most basic point and shoots will have this this ability to do what's called exposure compensation. So if I press that, if you look down here near the bottom of the display, you have -2, 1. It's a little hard to see with this bright background. Let me back out a little bit. There we go. -2, -1, 0, 1, and +2. What this is you're telling the camera, I know what you think, but you're wrong, camera. So I'm going to say, you know what, I want this to be brighter. So if I roll it to the right, you see how the scene gets brighter, right? That's 2 stops over, 2 f-stops over. That's 1 f-stop over when the green is on the 1 there. 0, it means you're just taking what the camera thinks. -1 means you're decreasing the exposure by 1 stop, and -2 means you're decreasing it by 2. So this can come in very handy if the camera is fooled by something and you know it's fooled. And one situation where it might be fooled, if there was somebody in front of this window, the camera might see all the light from the window and think, oh, it's pretty bright, I'm going to make a low exposure. But then the person is dark, right? So you might have to say, well, I want to expose for this dark person that's backlit. It's a backlight situation in the front of the window, so I'm going to add a little plus exposure compensation. So what happens to the window? The window gets blown out or overexposed, but the person that would be standing in front of it would now be brighter and you'd be able to see them, which is probably who you're taking the picture of, not the person, not the window behind the person. So that's very valuable, this exposure compensation, and that is usually on almost all cameras, even ones that don't have aperture priority and shutter priority. So that's a big one to remember. So I am going to go through the major settings that you'll see if I press this function button over on the right, which you can't see. The function button is over on this side over here. So the first one is the metering mode. So if I press on that and I go to that menu, there's 3 choices. There's evaluative, center weighted, and spot. So what does this mean? This means which part of the image is the camera going to look at to try to get their correct exposure. If it's on evaluative, it's going to look at the whole scene and try to get the whole scene sort of averaged out. If you put it on center, it's going to look more towards the center, obviously, and so it's going to take exposure more from that center area there. If I go to spot, it's going to be, oops, the other way. If I go to spot, it's even going to look more towards the center. You see how I got a little brighter? That's because it's looking at that sort of dark bookcase there in the back. And so it's saying, I'm only going to care about the very center of my image, and I'm going to expose for that. So most of the time you're going to leave this on evaluative. It's sort of probably going to give you the most accuracy most of the time. But sometimes, I like to use center weighted actually, because I know that it's looking in the middle. And I'm going to get a pretty good reading from just the center. Spot would be more specialized if there's only a small area that you're trying to meter. One of the good things is, if you're using center, for example, and this goes on with focus and a lot of different things, again, you can press halfway on the on the shutter button, and it will focus, expose, set all the settings it's going to set, and then you can recompose, which means move the camera and put something else in the middle. So I could press halfway, rotate the camera, change the perspective, whatever I want, and it would keep the same settings, so it would expose for whatever was in the middle there. So if I press that, it's exposed. It exposed for the middle. So that is, and that's a good little trick, is to press halfway. It will focus. It'll do the exposure correctly and the white balance and everything, and then it'll also shoot faster. So if you're trying to shoot something, that's moving a lot, like kids or something, especially with these smaller point shoots, they're a little slower to react than an SLR. So to get them halfway there, you can press that shutter button halfway down, and you'll be halfway there, and you'll see the exposure down there at the bottom. The next one down is My Colors. These are just ways to adjust the color in the camera. One of them is black and white, so sometimes people say, oh, I want to shoot a black and white image, so they'll put it on black and white. I would never do that, just because once you shoot with black and white in the camera, you're stuck with black and white. So you're better off actually just shooting normal with those colors off, and then you can do that kind of adjustment later in Photoshop if you want, and the result is you'll get a better image, and you still have a color image if you want one. If you shoot black and white in the camera, you're stuck with black and white. So I probably would leave that menu alone most of the time. The next one is white balance. White balance is basically what you are telling the camera the lighting conditions were when you shot the image or while you're shooting the image. So AWB on this camera is auto white balance. That means they're going to let the camera figure it out. You also have different lighting settings, basically different lighting color temperatures or color quality, lighting color. So here is daylight if you're shooting in the daylight. This is cloudy. This is tungsten, which means a light bulb. You see how the image got kind of blue? I'm telling the camera I'm shooting with tungsten even though I'm not. It's daylight coming in the window there. This is fluorescent. You see it might go kind of purple or green. Different fluorescent settings. There's also an evaluative or manual white balance on this camera. Some cameras will have that and some won't. In a different video, we'll probably go over how to set a manual white balance. It's also in your camera manual, which you should use. Unfortunately, it's good to read your manual. But one of the good things about shooting, so most of the time you can leave this on auto and you'll probably be okay. The cameras are getting pretty good at reading the white balance. One of the benefits of shooting RAW, if you have a camera that shoots RAW, is it really doesn't matter what your white balance is. You can go back after the fact and adjust it as if you never set it. It's just after the fact kind of processing. If you shoot JPEG, you're kind of stuck with that white balance that you used, so you might have to deal with something called color correction then, which we'll go over. It's also in your book too. The next setting down is ISO. So ISO is now set to auto. That again is the sensitivity of your light sensitive chip in your camera. Low numbers goes from low to high. Each one is about half as sensitive or twice as sensitive as the one next to it, just like you would get with aperture and shutter speed. So normally with this you're going to want a low number. The lower the better, which is going to give you the best image quality. The higher you go, the more noise you're going to get. So ISO is the thing you want to adjust last if you're trying to adjust exposure and you don't have enough light. You've already got a slow shutter speed. You already have a slow or a wide open aperture. The last thing you want to adjust is ISO, because you're going to get more noise, more bad pixels in there. So you might want to set this if you want to get the best quality to a low number, like the lowest, one of the lower ones on your camera. Generally, I think the cameras now, if you have them on auto, they're going to use a low number anyway, unless they have to use a higher one. So you're probably okay with auto most of the time. And one of the other things about ISO is you will have a better camera with a larger sensor will do better in low light usually. So, but the cameras are all getting better at that all the time too. The aperture, the recording mode stuff we've gone over, aperture priority, shutter priority, etc. There are some other modes in there. There's a program mode. So just to reiterate, the aperture priority means you're setting the aperture. Again, down here at the bottom you see the aperture changing. if you set it as shutter speed priority, you are setting the shutter speed, so the camera is setting the rest. So you see if I roll I'm rolling the control wheel now. The aperture or the shutter speed right there is changing when I roll the control wheel. So it's changing the aperture and or the ISO to make up for that. Program means on this camera it's going to set both, right? So it's kind of auto. And then this camera has this camera has a number of scene modes and special effects. So here's portrait, night snapshot, kids and pets, indoor, high-speed burst, low light, etc., etc., etc. Most of these you're not going to use too much. There's some of them are kind of goofy, like this fisheye effect, makes it look like a fisheye lens, a wide-angle lens. Miniature effect, which makes things look like they're small. Beaches, foliage, snow, etc., etc. Fireworks. What you're doing, the last one here are stitch assist. This is for doing panoramas, which we'll cover probably in a different video. It's also in your book. But what you're trying to do is help the camera out and telling it these kind of weird conditions that you're in, like fireworks or foliage or whatever you want to accent. It's hard to tell what actually these are going to do, so I tend to avoid them. Well, if you can kind of guess sometimes. So if you go to kids and pets, for example, it's probably going to use a faster shutter speed to try to catch the kids and the pets moving without blurring them. So, but you don't know really. I mean, you can look in the manual and it might tell you, but generally, a lot of professionals stick with the aperture priority unless they need a specific shutter speed for action or something, or slow to make things look fluid and kind of suggest motion. They might use shutter priority, but most of the time you're going to be at aperture priority so they can control depth of field, which we talk about in another video. The next one down is the self-timer. You can set the camera to wait, until you get in the shot, that kind of thing. Most cameras have that. The next one is drive mode. So this camera has two drive modes, single or continuous. What that means is if I press the shutter down all the way, is it going to shoot one shot, or is it going to keep shooting until I let go of the shutter? So that you would change. Maybe if you're going to do action, you might do continuous. Eventually it will stop. You'll fill up what's called the buffer in your camera, the internal memory, and it can't write the data fast enough to the card, so you shoot a number of shots and then it'll just stop because it's kind of, you've overloaded it and it has to wait till it writes the images to the card. So that is not that will come up if you shoot a lot of continuous shooting. The next one down is the image size. So you see this one has kind of the typical thing. You got different small, medium, and large sizes. It also has a wide angle view, like a HD kind of aspect ratio. Aspect ratio is the shape of the image. This camera is usually 4:3, I think, which is kind of TV shaped, or old TV shaped anyway, old school TV. And then, but it also shoots video. If I put it on the video mode, it shoots HD video mode, which is a wider aspect ratio. It's kind of a longer, skinnier, just like widescreen TV and old school squarish TV. So HD, or that aspect ratio, is 16:9 approximately, 16 units long, wide by 9 units high, but the regular camera modes are 3:4, which is kind of like the old TV shape. So 4 units wide by 3 high, that kind of thing. So what should you use? Large, medium, or small? Well, most of the time I would suggest probably using medium, unless you knew you were going to use really big prints or something, or you want to crop a lot. So the two reasons you want to use large images would be to crop or to blow up the images really large. The downside of using larges is you're going to have less shots that you can shoot in your camera. You see, if I put this this camera tells me how many shots I have left. So if I'm at medium 1, which is a 6 megapixel, I get about 2100 pictures left. If I get a large, I only get 1300. So it's a trade-off file size for, the size of the image. But again, you could use a large if you're going to crop it, or if you want to crop it or print it large. But if you're just shooting snapshots, you don't think you're going to do anything special with the images. You could probably get away with 6 megapixels is plenty. You can even print pretty big with that. Anything above that is strictly for cropping and really large prints. The last one on here is the compression quality. So on this camera it only has two settings. It has basic or normal and fine. I would almost never use the normal or basic settings on cameras. I would almost always have it on fine, or the highest quality that your camera has. It may call it super fine or something like that. The reason is it's going to look better. You're going to be able to store fewer images. You see it changes, from 4,300 shots to about 2,100 shots. But what it's going to do is put a higher compression on your JPEGs, and your image quality will degrade. It'll be damaged, basically. So you want nice images, right? You have a camera so you can take nice images. So I would always have it on fine or super fine, whatever your highest setting is. The only reason you might use this normal setting is if you knew you were going to run out of space, or you were using it to do like auto insurance adjustments or something, and you had to take millions of pictures a day, and you don't care at the quality, you just need a record of something. Then you could probably use a lower quality setting, but in general you want to stay at fine. And I think that is it for the menu underneath the function button. Just a bit more on Playback Display. If I hit the play button, which is up in the upper right on this camera, I will see images, of course, and then there's a number of different ways to display those images. So here is just the normal display. If I press the bottom of the function wheel on this camera anyway, it'll be somewhere else on yours probably. Then I see same thing, except I see some of the settings, the time, the day, the file name, stuff like that. The battery left is on. And then if I hit it again, I will see something a little more valuable. I will see some of the settings I used. You can see it was ISO 800, tenth of a second, f2, no exposure compensation, auto white balance, the file size, a bunch of stuff, file name. But the good part here is this. This is called the histogram, which you also see in the. You can see in a lot of cameras as well, but you can also see it in Photoshop and Camera Raw and different places that we'll see it. Basically, this is a bar graph that shows a distribution of the brightnesses in my image. So, since this is kind of a black couch in the background, I don't know if you can see it, but it will. There's a lot of pixels down here in the dark side. So in the middle, what you mostly want most of the time is kind of a mountain shape where you have most of your pixel brightnesses near the middle, which is middle gray. Over here to the right is going to be bright colors or bright pixels. Down here is going to be dark. So if you have a whole lot on the one side or the other, you have to be careful and make sure that your image looks okay. But generally you want your pixels near the middle, so you see kind of a mountain shape there. But this is fine because we have this black couch. That means there's a lot of black pixels in there, or dark, not black. So that's very valuable to see. Then also when I'm in this in the display mode, I can hit display again, and then I can see what the camera focused on, as well as what the metering pattern was, and it shows me a zoom in of what it metered on. So you can see that as well. So it has a couple of faces. I don't know if you can see little squares on there, and there's a square in the middle for what it was metering from. So that's another display. If I use the zoom now on top of the camera, the zoom now becomes a way to zoom in and out of the images. So I can zoom in, look around using the buttons on the function wheel to zoom around and look around the image and see maybe, is somebody smiling or their eyes open or whatever. If I go the other way, if I zoom out, it goes back to normal full size. If I go the other way, it starts to get smaller, and then you see I can start to navigate through these images. So now I can quickly go through all those images on a lot in my camera, and you see I can go choose the one I want to look at here. I'm just kind of going around. Different cameras will do this differently. As soon as I get to the one I want, I start to zoom back in, and then I see that particular image. And then I can obviously go left and right with the function wheel on this camera to scroll through them. I can also on this camera use the wheel and kind of wheel through them. If I go fast, it starts to turn into this carousel. So different kinds of cameras are going to do this in different ways. But generally it's going to be similar. You can use the zoom to zoom in and out of pictures. And that is the display function to review your images.